Hello, I am Carmel Hauck, T00701793. This is Peanut. She'll be my helper today. My kitten will be pushed off the counter. She does not need to be a part of it, so I'm going to start with Peanut's skull. She doesn't love when I touch her face, so I'm going to struggle through the first part, but we will make it happen. So the first bone we're going to talk about is the incisive bone. So it's the bone at the very front of the face here. It holds the incisors. It's the most rostral part of the skull. Then next we have our nasal bone, which is the nose and the dorsal part of the nasal cavity. So right here is the nasal bone on Peanut. This is where we can find the nasal turbinates, which are thin scrolls of bones up in the nostril itself. They help to moisten and warm the air that we're breathing in, and they also help to filter out particles and stuff like that. We also have the the maxilla, which are the two bones that make up the upper jaw, or most of the upper jaw. So her maxilla is about here and here on the sides. It's on both sides as well. The temporal bone contains the middle and inner ear functions and structures. Oh, so many animals. It also forms part of the zygomatic arch. So our temporal bone is about here on Peanut. It kind of goes along the side of her face up towards her. That is also where the external auditory meatus is, which is the actual opening to the ear, where it includes all the inner ear structures. The frontal bone is the two bones that form the forehead. So it's between her eyes. This is the frontal bone here, the two sides that join in the middle. This is where the frontal sinuses are too. They're underneath that frontal bone. The parietal bone are the two bones on either side of the midline. So the parietal bone is about here, the parietal bone. It's almost one of the most caudal parts of the skull. Then we have the mandible, which is the lower jaw. So again, there's two sides to the mandible. She has her mandible on this side here and her mandible on this side here. In our books, we see them as the body and the shaft. So the body here, shaft up this way. We also call it the horizontal ramus and the vertical ramus. So the horizontal ramus and then the vertical ramus. And the vertical ramus is what goes up to create that TMJ, that temporomandibular joint. So the vertical ramus forms with the temporal bone to create that joint. Is where we get our chewing motion from. It's where the bone articulates. And then the occipital bone is the very base of the skull here, way at the back where we have the occipital condyles, the foramen magnum, all that fun stuff where we connect to the vertebrae, which is our next part. So there's 5 types of vertebrae: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. The cervical vertebrae, I'm going to move her a little closer for this part. So the cervical vertebrae supports the head, protects the spinal cord. It starts with the C1, which is called the atlas, and it's right at the back of the head here. It helps to hold the skull. Next, we have the C2, which is called the axis. It helps to rotate her head to the side. It's the axis point of the skull. Then we have into the thoracic vertebrae, which is between the neck and the abdomen. It is dorsal to her thorax. Literally dorsal to her thorax, her thoracic vertebrae. For palpating, I was shown to palpate the dorsal spinal process. You kind of take 2 fingers and wiggle them back and forth. So if you wiggle down her spine, you can feel the protuberances, the processes where the little lumps are. And then I was taught to find the transverse spinous process. You're kind of doing a pinching motion. So you're going down along the spine and you're palpating along those bony dorsal processes, and that is where your transverse processes are on either side of the spine. The lumbar vertebrae is kind of end of ribs onwards. So lumbar vertebrae is about here. This is our lumbar vertebrae. It is dorsal to the abdomen. It is stronger than the thoracic vertebrae because it doesn't have the ribs. It has to support all the organs. It's a lot stronger. The sacral vertebrae in dogs, there are 3 sacral vertebrae that fuse together to form the sacrum. the numbers vary between species, but our sacral vertebrae is about this section right here. And finally, our coccygeal vertebrae is our little tail. So Peanut's got this cute little dinky tail. She has just a few of the coccygeal vertebrae. Some have more, some have less, but the coccygeal vertebrae are the tail bones, the last part, the most caudal portion of the whole body. And then ribs, her ribs are again in her thoracic region. There are 13 pairs of ribs in dogs, 9 that are sternal and 4 that are asternal. So the sternal ribs are cranial, the asternal ribs are caudal. And then the sternum is our next, which forms the floor of the thorax. So it's opposite kind of the spine. It is on the bottom. It's formed from sternebrae, which are the opposite of your vertebrae, sort of. For some points on the sternebrae that we can talk about are the manubrium, which is the most cranial sternebrae. So if you flip her around, if you feel this kind of bumpy spinous whatever bone here, that is her manubrium, so the most cranial sternebrae. And then her xiphoid process is way under here. It's kind of the end point of the ribs. You can feel where the ending sternebrae is. That's the most caudal one. Now the costochondral junction is the area where the bone of the rib meets the cartilage of the sternebrae. So I can't feel fully a difference on Peanut just because she's all chonkers, but I can feel her ribs, and I'm assuming around here is where they turn into the cartilage and form with the sternebrae, the sternum. So now we're moving on to the thoracic limb. So we're going to start with the scapula, which is a flat bone. It's a shoulder joint. You can feel the spine of the scapula around here, and it kind of follows through and joins with that humerus. And the humerus is what connects the scapula with the radius and ulna. The humerus, it has, well, here I will extend her humerus for you a little here. This up here is her humerus. It has the proximal end is the ball and joint socket with the shoulder joint, and at the other end, the distal end, it forms the forms the elbow joint with the radius and the ulna. Now the radius is around here. It is the cranial side of the leg. It is the bone on the cranial side. So the bone on the cranial side is the radius. And it articulates with the humerus and with the ulna. And the ulna is on the back of the leg, on the caudal side of her leg, and it forms the major portion of the elbow joint, which is also called the olecranon process. So right here, this little lump that I am feeling is called the olecranon process. It's the process that shuts off of the ulna. Back to the humerus, the greater tubercle is way up here. Now, if we're thinking the ball and joint socket is inside, then the tubercle I am feeling right now is right here. It's the greater tubercle. It's lateral to the head of the humerus, and it forms the point where like the shoulder's palpable. Now we're moving on to the carpus. So move you down a bit. The carpus. So for the most part, carpus is right about here. It forms kind of this process here where there are 2 rows of bones, a proximal and a distal row that make up the carpus. In dogs, there are 5 metacarpal bones. Same with cats, there are 5 metacarpal bones in the front. Can we show you her metacarpals? So there are her 5 bones.